Welcome back to our journey through the scriptures. We have followed the rise and fall of Israel's first king, Saul. Now, as the dust settles on the battlefield of Mount Gilboa, a new chapter begins. The shepherd boy, the giant slayer, the anointed one who has been running for his life, is about to hear news that will change everything. This is the story of King David. After Saul's death, David was in Ziklag, recovering from his own battle against the Amalekites. On the third day, a man appeared, his clothes torn, dust on his head, a messenger from the front lines. He fell before David and delivered the news. Israel had fled the battle, many had died, and King Saul and his son Jonathan were dead. Hoping for a reward, the young man, an Amalekite, spun a tale. He claimed he found Saul wounded and at the king's request had delivered the final blow. As proof, he presented Saul's crown and bracelet to David. But instead of a reward, he was met with horror. David and his men tore their clothes and mourned, weeping and fasting for Saul, for Jonathan, and for the nation of Israel. David then turned to the Amalekite. "How were you not afraid," he asked, "to destroy the Lord's anointed?" The man had condemned himself with his own words. David gave the order, and the messenger was struck down. Then, from the depths of his grief, David sang a lament, a song of mourning for the king who had hunted him and the friend who had loved him. "The beauty of Israel is slain," he cried. "How the mighty have fallen!" Saul and Jonathan, in life they were loved and gracious, and in death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. "I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Your love to me was wonderful, surpassing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perished." With the throne now vacant, David sought God's guidance. The Lord told him to go to Hebron, in the land of Judah. There, the men of Judah came and anointed him as their king. A reign had begun, but it was a kingdom divided. For Abner, the commander of Saul's army, took Saul's remaining son Ishbosheth and made him king over the rest of Israel. A long and bitter civil war began between the house of David and the house of Saul. The tension erupted at the pool of Gibeon, where 12 of David's men and 12 of Ishbosheth's men met in a deadly contest that turned into a bloody battle. David's men, led by the fierce Joab, were victorious. In the chase that followed, Joab's swift-footed brother, Asahel, was killed by Abner, planting a seed of vengeance that would soon bear bitter fruit. As the war dragged on, David grew stronger, while the house of Saul grew weaker. The breaking point came when Ishbosheth foolishly accused Abner of sleeping with one of Saul's concubines. Enraged, Abner switched his allegiance. He sent messengers to David, promising to bring all of Israel under his rule. David agreed, with one condition, that his first wife, Michal, Saul's daughter, be returned to him. Abner made good on his promise, persuading the elders of Israel to support David. He then came to Hebron, where David made a feast for him, but Joab, David's commander, was away raiding. When he returned and heard that Abner had come and gone in peace, his anger burned. He remembered his brother Asahel. Luring Abner back to the city gate under the pretense of a private word, Joab took his revenge, striking Abner down and killing him. David was innocent of the murder and mourned publicly for Abner, cursing Joab for his treachery. When Ishbosheth, Saul's son, heard that his commander was dead, he lost all courage. His downfall was swift. 2 of his own captains murdered him in his bed, bringing his head to David, expecting a reward. Like the Amalekite before them, they misjudged David's character. Outraged by their wicked deed, David had them executed. With the house of Saul now completely fallen, the path was clear. All the tribes of Israel came to David in Hebron. "We are your own flesh and blood," they declared. They remembered how he had led them in battle even under Saul. So the elders of Israel made a covenant with David, and they anointed him king over all Israel. He was 30 years old, and he would reign for 40 years. His first act as king of a united Israel was to march on Jerusalem, a fortress held by the Jebusites. They mocked him, saying even the blind and the lame could defend the city. But David conquered the stronghold of Zion, and it became his capital, the city of David. His kingdom grew, the Lord was with him, and alliances were made. With the kingdom established, David's heart turned to the ark of God. He gathered 30,000 men to bring the ark to Jerusalem with music and celebration. But their method was wrong. They placed the ark on a new cart, and when the oxen stumbled, a man named Uzzah reached out to steady it. The moment he touched the holy ark, God struck him dead. Fear fell on David. "How can the ark of the Lord come to me?" he asked. For 3 months the ark remained in the house of a man named Obed-Edom, and the Lord blessed his household. Hearing of this blessing, David took courage. This time he did it right. The Levites carried the ark on their shoulders, and with every 6 steps, sacrifices were made. David, casting off his royal robes for a simple linen ephod, danced before the Lord with all his might. As the ark entered the city with shouts and the sound of trumpets, his wife Michal looked down from a window and despised him in her heart for what she saw as undignified behavior. But David declared, "It was before the Lord. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this." Now at peace in his palace of cedar, David's heart was troubled. "I live in a house of cedar," he said to the prophet Nathan, "while the ark of God remains in a tent." He wanted to build a permanent temple for God, but God spoke to Nathan that night with a different plan. He told David, "Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in? I have been moving from place to place in a tent. It is not you who will build a house for me. I will establish a house for you." God made a covenant with David, promising him an everlasting dynasty. "When your days are over," God said, "I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever." Overwhelmed by this promise, David prayed a prayer of humble thanksgiving. David's reign was marked by military success. He subdued the Philistines, the Moabites, the Syrians, and the Edomites, expanding Israel's borders and bringing back great spoils, which he dedicated to the Lord. But amidst his victories as a king, he never forgot his covenant as a friend. He asked, "Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" He found one, Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, who was lame in both feet. David brought him to Jerusalem, restored to him all the land of his grandfather Saul, and gave him a permanent place at the king's table, treating him as one of his own sons. But even a man after God's own heart is not immune to temptation, and it was at the height of his power that David committed his greatest sin. It was springtime, the time when kings go off to war. But David remained in Jerusalem. One evening, from the roof of his palace, he saw a beautiful woman bathing. He sent someone to find out about her, and learned her name was Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite, one of his most loyal soldiers. David sent for her and slept with her. Soon she sent a message, "I am pregnant." Panic set in. David tried to cover his sin. He summoned Uriah from the battlefield, hoping he would go home to his wife. But Uriah, a man of honor, refused to enjoy the comforts of home while his comrades were at war. He slept at the palace door. David's next plan was to get him drunk, but even then, Uriah's integrity held. Desperate, David wrote a letter to his commander, Joab. He gave the letter to Uriah to deliver himself. The letter contained a death sentence. Put Uriah out in front where the fighting is fiercest. Then withdraw from him, so he will be struck down and die." Joab obeyed. Uriah the Hittite was killed in battle. After Bathsheba's time of mourning was over, David brought her into his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. The Lord sent the prophet Nathan to confront the king. Nathan told him a story about two men, one rich and one poor. The rich man had many flocks, but the poor man had only one little ewe lamb, which he loved like a daughter. When a traveler came to the rich man's house, the rich man, instead of taking one of his own sheep, took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for his guest. David's anger flared. "As surely as the Lord lives," he said, "the man who did this must die." And Nathan said to David, "You are the man." The words hit like a hammer blow. Nathan laid out David's sin in stark detail. "You killed Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. Now therefore the sword will never depart from your house." The consequences would be devastating. The child born to him would die. Broken, David confessed, "I have sinned against the Lord." Nathan assured him that God had forgiven him, that he would not die. But the consequences remained. The child became ill. For 7 days, David fasted and prayed, lying on the ground, pleading with God for the child's life. But on the 7th day, the child died. When his servants saw him rise, wash, and worship God, they were astonished. David explained, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he is dead, why should I go on fasting? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me." David then comforted his wife Bathsheba, and she conceived again, giving birth to a son named Solomon, whom the Lord loved. The sword, as Nathan prophesied, had entered David's house, and its first wounds were inflicted by his own children. David's eldest son, Amnon, became obsessed with his beautiful half-sister, Tamar. Feigning illness, he lured her to his room, and despite her desperate pleas, he raped her. Then his twisted love turned to intense hatred, and he threw her out. Tamar's full brother, Absalom, saw her grief, and a cold, patient hatred took root in his heart. David was furious when he heard, but he did nothing to punish his firstborn son. For 2 full years, Absalom held his peace, hiding his rage. Then he invited all the king's sons to a sheep shearing festival. When Amnon's heart was merry with wine, Absalom gave the signal, and his servants struck Amnon down, killing him. In the ensuing panic, the rest of David's sons fled. Absalom fled into exile for 3 years. David mourned for Amnon, but in time his heart began to long for his living son, Absalom. Joab, ever the shrewd operator, perceived the king's longing. He arranged for a wise woman to come to David with a fabricated story about her 2 sons, one of whom had killed the other, to illustrate a point about mercy for a banished son. David saw through the ruse and recognized Joab's hand in it, but the story worked. He gave Joab permission to bring Absalom back to Jerusalem, but on one condition: he must not see my face. For 2 more years, Absalom lived in Jerusalem, a prince in the city, but an outcast from the palace. Famed for his handsome appearance, he grew resentful. When Joab refused to see him, Absalom had his servants set Joab's barley field on fire, a desperate act that finally got Joab's attention. Absalom was at last brought before the king, and David kissed his son, a sign of full reconciliation. But the reconciliation was a sham. Absalom began a subtle, calculated campaign to undermine his father. He would stand at the city gate, intercepting those who came to the king for justice. He listened to their cases, told them they were right, and then lamented that the king had no one to hear them. "If only I were judge in the land," he would say. With false humility and warm embraces, he stole the hearts of the men of Israel. The conspiracy came to a head when Absalom went to Hebron, the very place his father was first crowned, and had trumpets sound throughout the land, proclaiming, "Absalom is king." The rebellion was so strong and swift that David was forced to flee Jerusalem with his household and his loyal followers. As he left the city, weeping and barefoot, he was met by Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, who brought supplies and falsely claimed his master was hoping to regain the kingdom. Later, a man from Saul's clan named Shimei followed David's party, throwing stones and cursing him. David endured it all, accepting it as perhaps the will of the Lord. But David was not without a plan. He sent his trusted counselor, Hushai, back into Jerusalem to pretend to join Absalom, in order to thwart the counsel of Absalom's chief advisor, the brilliant Ahithophel. When Absalom entered Jerusalem, Ahithophel gave him shrewd, ruthless advice. First, to publicly sleep with David's concubines, an act that would make the break with his father irreparable, and second, to let him take 12,000 men and pursue David that very night while he was weary and vulnerable. This was the critical moment, but Hushai, playing his part, argued against Ahithophel's sound military advice. He painted a picture of David and his men as cornered, ferocious warriors. He proposed a slower, grander strategy to gather all of Israel into a massive army with Absalom himself leading them. Flattered and overconfident, Absalom and his men chose Hushai's disastrous advice over Ahithophel's wise counsel. The Lord had ordained it to bring ruin upon Absalom. When Ahithophel saw that his counsel was not followed, he went home, put his house in order, and hanged himself. The delay gave David time to escape across the Jordan River and regroup his forces. The battle was joined in the forest of Ephraim. Before his commanders went out, David gave them one command: "Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom." David's veteran army overwhelmed Absalom's forces. As Absalom fled on his mule, his thick hair caught in the branches of a great oak tree, leaving him suspended between heaven and earth. A soldier saw him but refused to harm him, remembering the king's command. But Joab had no such scruples. Taking 3 javelins, he thrust them into Absalom's heart. They threw his body into a pit and covered it with a great heap of stones. The rebellion was over. Now, the news had to be carried to the king, who waited anxiously at the city gate. 2 runners came. The first, Ahimaaz, gave a vague report of victory. Then the second runner, a Cushite, arrived. David's first and only question was, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" The Cushite's answer was devastating. "May the enemies of my lord the king be like that young man." The king was shattered. The victory turned to mourning. He went up to the chamber over the gate and wept, crying out, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." His grief was so profound that it shamed his victorious army. It was Joab who once again confronted him, telling him bluntly that he was honoring his enemies and shaming those who had just saved his life. David pulled himself together and began the long journey back to Jerusalem. On his return, he showed mercy. He pardoned the cursing Shimei. He met Mephibosheth, who claimed his servant Ziba had slandered him, and David, perhaps unsure of the truth, divided the land between them. He honored the aged Barzillai who had provided for him in his exile. But even in his return, the seeds of division were sown. The men of Israel and the men of Judah argued over who had more right to the king. This squabble was ignited into another rebellion by a troublemaker named Sheba. David appointed a new commander, Amasa, to quell the revolt. But the ruthless Joab, seeing his position threatened, murdered Amasa in cold blood and took command himself, swiftly crushing the rebellion. David was king again, but his house was stained with blood, and his kingdom fractured by suspicion. The final years of David's reign were a mixture of trouble and triumph. A 3-year famine struck the land because of a sin Saul had committed against the Gibeonites. Justice was served, and the famine ended. More wars were fought with the Philistines, where David's mighty men slew the last of the giants. In these pages, we hear David's own voice in a majestic song of praise, a psalm of deliverance, celebrating God as his rock, his fortress, and his shield. We read his last words, a reflection on God's everlasting covenant, but the story ends with one last failing. Moved by pride, David insisted on taking a census of his fighting men, a sin of trusting in numbers rather than in God. God gave him a choice of 3 punishments: famine, defeat in battle, or pestilence. David chose to fall into the hands of a merciful God rather than men. A plague swept through Israel, killing 70,000. As the angel of death reached Jerusalem, David cried out in repentance. God relented and told David to build an altar on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. David bought the site, refusing to offer a sacrifice that cost him nothing. There he built the altar, and the plague was stopped. Upon this very ground, his son Solomon would one day build the magnificent temple to the Lord. David's reign, born in anointing and forged in war, marked by great faith and tragic failure, ends here, with an act of sacrifice and atonement, paving the way for the future of Israel.